You know what they say. No one hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. Star Wars fanboys have notoriously been the worst, with very questionable human boundaries. Whether it's their disgusting treat of Kelly Marie Tran, or the way they absolutely attack Kathleen Kennedy, Star Wars fans fail to sort of understand boundaries. And I often feel that Star Wars fans are actively not trying to enjoy the universe at all. Disney's time with Star Wars has been a mixed output, to say the very least, with more times than not the fandom being left completely dissatisfied with the final product, most especially when it came to the sequel trilogy, which, my god, were a mess. Trust me, I'm going to get to them one day. And unfortunately, with most of Star Wars projects, I do tend to agree with the common consensus of these Star Wars fanboys. Rogue One, The Clone Wars 7th season, The Mandalorian and Andor were great. Bad Batch, The Force Awakens and Rebels were a mixed bag. The Last Jedi and The Book of Boba Fett were a mess with very few redeemable things. And The Rise of Skywalker was a disaster. Enough said there. However, there's one show that I think is severely unfairly criticised, with most of its arguments being invalid for me. And that is Kenobi. For years, Star Wars fans begged to see Ewan McGregor return to the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi in a movie. However, that dream was quickly collapsed after the failure of Solo at the box office. I've just realised while going through the script that I forgot Solo earlier and talk about Star Wars, but that's how forgettable it was. Right, it was actually alright, to be fair. The breakout hit that was The Mandalorian. It seems that shows were the way to go with Star Wars as a sort of healing process from the theatrical disasters, and the Kenobi project, alas, was reborn. The hype, the anticipation, everything was all good for Kenobi. Everyone was still faithful even after failures of things like The Book of Boba Fett or The Rise of Skywalker. But then the trailer released, and the internet did their best impression of the UK government and made a massive U-turn. And not even the announcement that Hayden Christensen would return as Anakin Skywalker could redeem this project. It's my belief that many fans went in with the mindset to hate this show and wanting to hate it. An overall reception for the show was very meh, while many saying it didn't reach the Book of Boba Fett's lows, and they definitely enjoyed the Vader and Obi-Wan stuff, but pretty much hated everything else in the show. So this show is just proclaimed as terrible, right? But why? That's always my question. That's always my question for those who hate Kenobi. A lot of people say it was terrible and laughably bad in the writing department and in pretty much every way, but many fail to articulate and elaborate on that opinion. So I'm going to defend this show, squashing every single criticism aimed at the show, and showing it why it's just as good as the best of the Disney era. No, it's not better than Andor or The Mandalorian, but I definitely think it deserves so much more credit than it gets. So I've narrowed the most common criticisms into a few subcategories. Those being the absolute silly and stupid scenes, with most notably Kid Leia running away from guards with... I mean, how did a 10-year-old child outrun those guards? Oh, it ruins the show, doesn't it? The entire character of Reva, third sister, Kid Leia, the fact the show is pointless and ruins canon, and finally the directing and the effects are poor. Okay, let's start with the worst one. This show was so heavily ridiculed for a few dumb scenes. The two I'm referring to is Kid Leia being able to outrun some trained Imperial guards with ease, and Obi-Wan hiding Leia in his coat. I just find these such irrelevant criticism. Now I assume if you've seen Kenobi, you've watched the original trilogy. Now one thing you'd know if you've seen the original trilogy is those films were filled to the brim with goofy and silly scenes. And no, I'm not talking about the stuff they added later, like in the Jabba's Palace stuff. I mean, if you watch A New Hope, there's a scene where bloody a stormtrooper Han tries to do stupid impression to trick some stormtroopers. There's a scene where he runs down the alleyway and bloody runs into a bunch of stormtroopers. There's a scene where Luke Skywalker whines about a power converter. I mean, they're not exactly Oscar-worthy films, are they? Like, and those films were so filled with plot holes and things that add up, but they never distract from the great elements that were present in those films. And both these scenes can be explained. The Leia one is just simply poor directing, to be honest, to be blunt, and it doesn't really take you out of it. And the coat thing is even worse. It was an on his fault feat that just didn't even work. I mean, what was he meant to do in that situation? It was worth a try. Reva literally catches the guy. It's not like he pulled off the stunt. If he would have pulled off the stunt, maybe you could raise a few more eyebrows. But so anyone who complains about these minute details and these little stupid scenes just doesn't get what George Lucas even aimed for Star Wars to be. Now for me, Reva is really overhated. Was she a perfect character and really necessary to the show? No. But I don't get what's so bad about her. There's obviously two groups who hate this character. You have the anti-woke group who can just be instantly discarded, and then you have people who just didn't enjoy the character. But I think she served her purpose in the show. We needed a villain to be a constant threat to Kenobi as a pedestal to Vader, and Reva works well. And while her reason to hate Kenobi is extremely weak, that's the point. She was an impulsive child who faced such a trauma. And her reason to become an Inquisitor is a chance to get back at Vader, only for Vader to read her like an open book. It's very in line with Vader, and well, I personally think Reva definitely should have died in the 5th episode. Her redemption in the final episode is fine and believable. I've seen people complain that she was not threatening and lacked the intimidation. I think you're misinterpreting what the character's supposed to be. She's supposed to be petty. She's supposed to not really be that intimidating. You know, the Grand Inquisitor she's being used. She's a bait. She's a pawn. That's the whole twist, and she's trying to do this thing to get back at Vader, and Vader knows exactly what she's trying to do and is using her, and that's a great, showing Vader's manipulation. And I don't get what was so bad about this character. And I think another reason that people may hate this character was that they feel the whole thing was just a build-up for her own spin-off. And come on, every show now is trying to set up a spin-off with other projects. That's literally the backbone of the MCU's existence. So people who feel like Reva is just a complete setup, it's just unfair. Of course she is. So overall, Reva works in the show. And I feel is still a much better written character than everyone in the sequels that wasn't named Kylo. Now, as for Kid Leia, one criticism I can get behind is this is the 3rd show where a male character has to protect and rescue a child. However, as a standalone show, it isn't an issue, and I think it was more an issue with what other shows did. And I actually thought Leia was a clever catalyst to actually get Obi-Wan off Tatooine, and people complaining that he'd leave Luke to do this is like, Leia and Luke were just as equal as priorities, and this was the best way to get him off. And even he had reluctance, he didn't want to, and that kind of plays into his buddy arc. And for the people who do complain that he had to leave Tatooine for the show, obviously you can't make 6 episodes of him drinking blue milk and staring at a 10-year-old kid from the distance when he has no growth and just sits in mourning despair with the reality of what's happened. Like, I feel like that's what everyone pitched Kenobi to be, but in practice that was never going to work, was it? Leia was a really good idea that really adds more weight to the actual original trilogy, to Leia's lead from A New Hope. Also, the reason that she doesn't mention this in A New Hope is actually cleverly done, as in the end Kenobi tells her to never speak of the events, which was, protecting the canon, which we'll get to later. Also, I think Leia works very well off of Kenobi because she's got this optimism and kind of confidence that is completely in contrast to Kenobi, who is broken and lost. I think through her we kind of see him rejuvenate and kind of get some of that whimsicalness and something that we know Kenobi for, and he gets a bit more in line with who he is. The actress really sells the role, and I can believe this girl absolutely grows up to be the late Carrie Fisher. Also serves as a great way for Obi-Wan and Reva to actually deliver monologues, and the conclusion they both get to is so beautiful with the final goodbye. Yeah, in the latter episode she was deemed a bit pointless, but I think, she didn't bring the show down. I think she does it, and she's a lot more less obnoxious than, say, Omega in The Bad Batch, who does bring that show down. Now we have the people who call this show unnecessary, and I feel like people who say this didn't even watch the show, and just want that opinion to ring true. Many were worried at the prospect of a 3rd Kenobi and Vader duel, and worried it could tarnish Revenge of the Sith in some way, and as well as A New Hope, and found this just a cash grab. However, the show finds a way to make lines from A New Hope make even more sense in retrospect. This show is so careful with canon. You can feel that Deborah Chow really cared about little things, like for example Luke Skywalker not seeing a lightsaber. This show knew its limits and found a way to expand what was already there. One of my favourite things it did was there's a line in Return of the Jedi where Luke Skywalker goes to Vader something along the lines of, I know there's still some light inside of you, and Vader's like, Obi-Wan once felt the same way, and well, if you watch Revenge of the Sith, he clearly didn't, considering he left him to die. However, in this show, they kind of make that line more clever, and I love when stuff does that. And they really found a way to expand what was already there. And I'm sorry, just calling something pointless is a weak argument. Everything after A New Hope can be considered a cash grab, and I must say, Sir Alec Guinness definitely thought that. So this was made because fans wanted it, and I find it very hypocritical. They did what they could with established canon, and if anything, they were dealt with a difficult hand. However, the final criticism, unfortunately, I do find almost valid. However, I don't think Rue is enough to ruin the show, as the directing and cinematography is very poor in a few cases and does contribute to a few of the other issues people have with this show. Another criticism I can sort of get behind, but I'm kind of indifferent to it after reading up and watching a few other videos, is people saying we don't get enough time with Kenobi mourning and regret. And that's why I probably wouldn't be against a second season. However, I do think he gets a good arc in the show, and I think I like episode 1 is quite slow in the first half, and you can tell like he isn't the same guy. And I think they do bits and pieces, and there is some really good kind of quiet moments and simple moments of him mourning, but I think they could have done more with that. So that's the main issues I have disregarded. Let's talk about the things that actually really worked in the show. Vader is incredible in this show. His hatred for Kenobi is still there. And his emotional flaws are so evident. And he is still so much of a learner. I feel like this show makes Vader feel even more human than we ever got in the original trilogy. As he's very much, still emotional. He's still very much leaning on to the things that Palpatine wouldn't want him to. And I feel like that's, we see that kind of transition in the middle. However, he still upholds that absolute badass presence. The guy literally set Kenobi on fire in the show. However, it's clear that Vader's still adjusting it to his suit, and there is kind of this stiffness and uncomfortableness, and I feel like we do visualise the journey of how his hatred consumed Anakin is going to a more controlled and stoic Vader. And seeing mid-transition, it's just so great. I really love everything they do with Vader. I also actually really like the Lards in this. Lards and Beru getting actual moments to show competence. And I think his relationship with Kenobi is really fascinating. And I feel like it adds a lot more to A New Hope as well. And gives more characterization than the original 6 films ever gave these two. Also, the whole idea of Talia was quite great. Seeing an Imperial turn up against the Empire is a neat idea. However, I feel like she could have been fleshed out more. And it definitely didn't have the impact the writers thought it did. I also think the atmosphere, gruesomeness and cruelty of the time period is also really well defined for me. And they do so well tonally. And you really get the sense that we're in a messy part of the galaxy. Overall, I find many who hate this show hypocritical. They begged for an Obi-Wan movie and were disappointed with this, and I really think this is the best they could have done with the severe limitations. And they're extremely creative in places and so careful with the canon. And I just feel so many of this show's criticisms are unfair. And I really think in isolation without other projects like the Book of Boba Fett, frustration in this show, it would have been more respected and less ridiculed. So all I hope is you're respectful. And please, if you feel like there's anything I've overlooked in the criticism department, please tell me, and I'm prepared to debate. Alright, so, next week's video, which you can check the community tab already, because I've already put the schedule there, so I don't know why I do this bit, but it's going to be a bit of a throwback. I'm going to be doing a How to Be video, which is a bit of an old style, but then coming up, I've got another song-based video. I'm going to do a top 10 all-time Ed Sheeran songs, and the next film commentary video is going to be on the Suicide Squad 2021 and why that film is just genius. I don't care what you have to say, that film was incredible. Right, I hope you enjoyed. I'm Lewis, goodbye.